Hi there, BookTube. It's a sunny afternoon here, which is lovely. So I've got the window open again. Let's cross our fingers for no squealing children today. Maybe the odd seagull going past. That's okay. We're all right with that. Sorry about the video last week with the noisy children in the background. So this week I have read, amongst other things, a couple of books of new fiction, that are kind of in the bookish news at the moment. Pod by Laline Paull was published in February of this year, but it's back on the front page of bookish news, I guess, because it's just been selected for the shortlist for the Women's Prize. And Shy by Max Porter was published just about 3 weeks ago when I'm making this, like early April, and was, I guess, one of the most anticipated new releases of this spring, because two of his three previous books, Lanny and Grief is a Thing with Feathers, were both, real, hits, as it were, in literary fiction terms, at least. Why am I talking about these two together? Obviously, one blatantly obvious reason is they both got 3-letter words as their titles, haven't they? But that's not it. That's not really why. They both have youngish to middle-aged British authors. They're both books that are in some sense unconventional as novels. They're neither of them overly long, something I like. They're both books that wear their heart on their sleeve, I would say. And yeah, we'll come back to that, I think, in this review. But the most important similarity between them, I think, and really why I've wanted to put the two together, is they're both books where the author sets out to get inside the head of someone or something that's kind of different from their own experience. Yes, in Porter's case, that's a troubled teenage boy, and in Paul's case, that's a dolphin, and as the main character, and then other sea creatures around them. And it's very clear that both authors, they really, want to give their main character or characters a voice and I don't know, an opportunity to be heard. That's the feels like that's the motivation behind those choices. But that's an interesting thing to do in a kind of literary climate where there's so much autofiction around, and real emphasis on own voice writing, which is a real positive, but it's probably perhaps more challenging for an author now to write something that's way out of their own experience or get it published, and unless it's historical fiction or genre fiction, but a straight novel. Yeah, what do you think about that? Interested in having some opinions. Anyway, let's talk about these two. And the other thing I should say is I think these are both books that have sort of divided opinion, provoked some quite diverse reactions, I suppose. I'm going to start with Shy by Max Porter. Really quite a short book, and actually even shorter than it looks, because some of the, it's quite kind of spaced out at times. It gives you a bit of an illustration, doesn't it? What to say about this book? Well, on a practical note, get a paper copy, because it relies on changes of font and ways that things are laid out on the page. It's sort of it was something that you probably realise if you read Lanny, for example, that's something that Porter does. But you're not going to get the same thing from an ebook, or I don't think for an audiobook either, because we have a kind of an omniscient narrator that is following Shy, this boy, really closely, and is he's at a sort of a kind of last chance residential school and home for troubled teenage boys, and with sort of social, emotional, mental health difficulties, been excluded. It's alternative provision. They've been excluded from mainstream schools, not and yeah, so mostly we're there with Shy through this, but third person, through a narrator. But then we get other voices coming in that are in the different fonts that are things that people have said to Shy, things that have lodged in his memory, perhaps, things that he's thinking back to, moments when there's perhaps it appears to be a TV crew at the home making a documentary, and you get little bits that are about, they come into a space and you get a description of the space because it's through the eyes of the camera, as it were. So, mixed voices, but mostly we're very kind of closely and intensely with Shy. And this is quite a dark book. That's something to bear in mind if that's something that is, potentially an issue for you. I suppose it's a trigger warning. I don't really do those, but, like suicidal ideation and so on is very much in this book. Shy is in a very tough place mentally and emotionally. Porter has a good way with words, I would say. And he's got a kind of an eye for, I don't know, the things that are unsettling or a little uncanny. Landscape and history and animals, tend to sort of feature in his books. All his books so far have been very much centered in a sort of an English countryside kind of environment, or with grief is a thing. The thing with Feathers had Crow as a key character or influence on the story. He's also someone that brings a lot of emotion, I suppose, to his books. And, this book is very empathetic about how it is to be a young man like Shy, about his distress and his confusion and the way, sometimes he will lash out and then maybe experience, regret, his sense of desperation at times. I think it's hard for Porter not to sometimes let the sort of middle-aged, middle-class author's voice slip into the book more than he probably wanted or intended. I think, he set himself a huge challenge, I suppose, to be really authentically, as I say, conveying the mind and experience of a young man with Shy's sort of difficulties, and he just about pulls it off, I think. I have to say, it's not as, I didn't find it as intensely moving as I did Grief is The Thing with Feathers, and I didn't find it as kind of beguiling and yet, an odd as Lanny. So this was a 4-star book for me, but not a 5-star book in that crude star rating sort of way. So what about Pod? Now, Pod, Laline Paull, I have an automatic reaction, abreaction, in fact, to books with animals as characters. I'm very wary of them. It doesn't often work for me. I recently read Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus, which is a huge bestseller. I found that book quite irritating, but it was my book group, my real life book group book, so I kind of had to read it, but I came very close to DNFing, bailing on it at the point where the dog started talking. We were inside the head of the dog. It's like, oh, for goodness sake, don't, doesn't do it for me. What's different about Pod, I suppose, is it's not a sort of throwing an animal character into a book. What she is setting out to do is to kind of create a convincing world of plot and character that is a dolphin and two or more than one, and Pod, so sort of cetacean society, I suppose, and other sea creatures, and you'd really immerse you in that without anthropomorphizing them. Now that kind of worked for me, I think, for the cetaceans, because we know that they have that kind of a higher level kind of consciousness that's probably similar to ours. We know they have complex social relationships and language, of not like our language, but nevertheless what appears to be a sophisticated language. So to then turn that into words that we can understand is not a ridiculous thing to do. It was less successful for me when we had the odd fish or clams. I mean, she does sort of tone down, I think, their level of sort of language and consciousness, but it's still, there's one character in particular that's like a kind of a sucker fish that attaches itself. It's sort of parasitic. I don't know. Anyway, that one didn't do it for me. But I did warm to this book. It did overcome my prejudice, and I probably would never have picked it up if it hadn't been for hearing some real enthusiasm for it from some other people on BookTube, Britta, for example, and Kit the Reader. Have you discovered Kit the Reader's channel yet? If you haven't, I'll link to it down below, because you should. They're great. So their enthusiasm tipped the balance for me, and I'm glad I did, because as I say, I did take to it eventually. This is absolutely not a cuddly book. If we're going to do trigger warnings in this video, this book definitely needs one. There's a lot of sexual violence and rape in the book, and that is it's quite central to the plot, and it's no less disturbing to me as a woman reader, just because it's dolphins that are being portrayed. That's quite powerful. This book has themes of sort of gender relationships and the impact of sort of perhaps external pressures on how societies, I'm trying to put it, when you've got sort of external forces, whether, fear, displacement, limited resources, and the effect that can have on how, I was going to say people, but, beings, social beings interact when those things are happening to them. And that's a kind of key message of the book. As I say, it's also about migration, displacement, competition for resources, all of that. Essentially, I say Paull has a message that she wants to convey in this book about our impact on the life of the oceans, and that's quite explicit. Her intention, and I think it's a good intention, and one that I kind of support, but that could be what kind of tipped it for me to being a 4 rather than a 5-star book, despite being able to sort of accommodate the speaking creatures. If you really warm to a book that wears its heart on its sleeve, then you might enjoy this even more than I did, I think. So two books for me that were good but not top level good. Have you read them? Tell me what you think.